Webhooks in N8N can be extraordinarily powerful, but a lot of people misunderstand how they work. So in this video, I'm going to run you through everything you need to know about the N8N webhook game to crush it. Let's get into it. So I'm going to get into the N8N canvas in a second, but just before I do, I want to talk a little bit about what webhooks even are, because I feel like in N8N and a lot of no and low code tools in general, there's a big misunderstanding. So to make things extraordinarily simple, all webhooks are, is they are messages. They're nicely formatted messages, but they're messages. So if you have two apps, let's just call this app A, and over here, we'll call this app B. All a webhook is this just a message from maybe app A to app B, or from app B to app A. Just a text, a very specifically formatted text. It's like if you are going to the grocery store and you see your friend's ex-girlfriend or something, and you're like, hey, I just saw Stacy at the store, right? That is the webhook. It's just we're formatting it in a very particular way. So to make this a little more practical, since we're using a no and low code tool, presumably for the purposes of business, let me just cover a set of examples, but let me just do one so we can actually jump into building. Let's say this app A here is, I don't know, it's like an email client, okay? So this is your email client. I don't know, it's your Gmail or your Outlook or whatever. And basically what happens is when I get a new email, right, what I'll do is I'll send a webhook. This is a very common flow. A lot of businesses do exactly this. I'll send a webhook over to, let's say app B is your CRM. When I get a new email, what I want to do is I want to add some data to my CRM. I do that using a webhook. So this is your new email. You go in your email client, you configure some webhook, then you send it over to your CRM. And what you do is you add a new record, maybe with like the email address, which is encapsulated in the webhook data. I don't know, the first name, right? Last name, all sorts of stuff. I can tell my writing is kind of getting Dr. Scrawly, so I'll stop there. But essentially, that's all webhooks are. They're just little packets of data that we send to and from apps. Now, the reason why they've become so prevalent in the 2020s and beyond is because we're kind of getting in the habit of integrating things, right? And the purpose of a no or low code tool, kind of at its core, is to glue a bunch of different platforms together. So naturally, webhooks are a core part of how you get really good with these things. So, whether you're using make.com or Zapier or hell, any no or low code platform, you're going to have webhooks. N8N exposes webhook functionality to us in a couple of simple ways. The first is we have the ability to catch a webhook. That's what it is called when you receive one of these messages using the webhook node. And we also have the ability, this is sort of advanced, I'm going to show you it right now anyway. We also have the ability to send data from N8N to the source that sent us the webhook to begin with. So basically respond to an incoming webhook. Now we're going to cover how this works in a moment, but essentially these two pieces of functionality nowadays are like a core part of how the internet operates. And they're one of the reasons why N8N is great, because they allow you to very quickly and easily slot into any app, whether or not it has like a built-in integration. If we click on this little button and we search for actions, don't get me wrong, there are quite a few actions here, maybe a few hundred, but there are many more apps than this out there on the internet. And if you want to be able to integrate all of those apps together, well, you can't just go down this list because the vast majority of them don't exist. What you need to do is you need to find some sort of custom way to do so. Webhooks are that custom way, and that's what we're going to be covering. All right, so now that we're done with that brief little intro, let's talk about how webhooks actually work in N8N. So to make a long story short, we use this webhook node, okay? And essentially, if I just escape out of that, let me organize this as N8N course. Essentially, all a webhook node in N8N does is it exposes a custom URL for us. Now I'm using N8N Cloud, which is why my URL looks like this, nixarchive.app.n8n.cloud. You may be using a self-hosted version of N8N, so yours will look a little bit different. And if yours says a local host, we'll chat about at the end of the video, how to route requests to local hosts, specifically for self-hosted setups. Usually they use like Docker or whatever. But essentially all we've done by creating this webhook node is we just exposed a URL. We now have a URL, basically, that you can send or receive data to with in order to trigger something or glue. We've created a little Lego block almost, right? And I just want you guys to think about that. We've created a Lego block that you can use to connect to other Lego blocks and further your build. So a bunch of fields here. The first is test URL versus production URL. A lot of people misunderstand this. Essentially, test URL is just what you should use before you've made your workflow live, before it's in production, before you're actually implementing into a business, your business or somebody else's, okay? This test URL is always going to have a webhook-test somewhere in it. If we move over to production, you'll see that the webhook-test is replaced with just webhook. But you'll notice that there's kind of a pattern here, right? Sure, webhook-test went to just webhook, but basically everything else stayed the same. The reason why, if we just scroll past this HTTP method get, is because we've set a path here, and the path remains the same, regardless of whether it's test URL or production URL. The really cool thing about the path is you can actually make this whatever you want. So I could call this my super cool webhook listener, for instance, right? You have total control over what you want that path to be. Anywho, let's get back to this test URL. Let's just leave this as some super big, long, totally custom, not at all. I mean, maybe it's not super randomized. I bet you the incidence of the F, A, and S, and D characters are probably much higher than all the other characters on here, just because that's where my fingers are, but hey, what are you going to do? Next, we get to the HTTP method field. If we scroll through here, you'll see that there are a variety of what are called methods using HTTP. HTTP being a protocol called the Hypertext Transfer Protocol, which is just an agreement that a bunch of people had, 20 or 30 or maybe even 40 years ago now. I'd have to double check on just how two computers might interact. And so there are a bunch of these agreed upon mechanisms. There's delete, there's get, head, patch, post, or put. In practice, the two that you're probably going to be using the most often are get and post. And basically, every time that you send a request on the internet using HTTP, you'll have some sort of method attached to it. And what we can do here is we could just say, hey, I only want you to respond or only want you to proceed if you receive a request that is formatted using one of these methods, aka the method I specify. So in our case, we're responding to only the get method. So if you try and send a request using, patch or put or post or delete in N8N, you're actually not going to trigger the flow. And I'll show you what that looks like in just a minute. Okay, then we get our path field, which I've already talked about. Next, we get our authentication field. Now, the authentication field is commonly misunderstood. First of all, because N8N defaults to authentication, you see when I created this, it immediately went to header auth. A lot of people think you need authentication for webhooks, and if you don't, it's necessarily bad practice or whatever. It's not actually bad practice. I don't use authentication in a lot of my webhooks. I don't use it here. I might have some filter or something like that that just does not allow requests to come in. But typically when you're testing, I typically test with no authentication. That's what I'm going to build the flow out here with, and then I'll show you how authentication actually works later. But basically, if you think about it, because you're exposing this URL to the internet, mixerrive.app.n8n.cloud/webhook-test, if you think about it, anybody can access that URL and anybody can send or receive a request to it. So authentication is just a way that you say, hey, I don't want everybody to be able to do this. I'm going to make a secret little password. And if you don't have the secret little password, then my webhook listener is not going to actually trigger the flow. Sounds pretty simple, right? Variety of ways to do this. There's basic auth, header auth, JSON web token auth. There are a variety of different ways to do this. These specific ones here aren't super important. I just want you to think about it as like a password example. When you knock on a door, what's the secret password? If you don't have it, we don't do anything. Then the last parameter or field here is how you want to respond. There are three different ways to respond on N8N. There's immediately, which means the second that we receive the request, we respond. There's when the last node finishes. So if in our workflow, we build out a massive, list of, 30 or 40 or 50 nodes, we'll actually wait until that last one's ready. And then using the respond to webhook node, which is that node that I just showed you, which is really what the bulk of this video is going to be about. It's going to be how to respond to webhook events with presumably whatever data we want. How to do something and then send things back. So I'm going to be covering all three of these in a moment. Last but not least, we have some options. I'm not going to cover all of these because in practice, they're not super important, but I usually recommend turning on ignore bots. There's also, raw body response code. You could tell the server that sent the request how you want to handle it. If you want to say, hey, this succeeded. Hey, I've created the request, but I haven't done anything with it. Hey, there's no content. The request is processed, but nothing happened. Hey, this is a redirect 300 series. Hey, this is a bad request. It's unauthorized. It's forbidden. You have the power to basically control how your little endpoint responds to incoming requests. Now, for the most part, presumably you're going to want your responses to be 200. You're going to want them to do something. I'll show you what this looks like. Okay, so knowing that we have this webhook now that is set up, okay, how do we actually go ahead and trigger that webhook? Well, here's one thing that the vast majority of people don't know, right? Because this is a URL, right? Just like Google, you can actually access this just by navigating to it in your browser. It's by far the simplest way to do so. And when you navigate to something in your browser, you just send it a GET request. So let me show you what this looks like. You see, I'm just going to click to copy this webhook URL. I'm going to listen for a test event. move over here, and I'm actually just going to open up a new tab and enter. And notice what we got back. We got in the standard formatted JSON JavaScript object notation that says message workflow was started. Now, if I go back to this tab, what you'll see is we now have a ton of output. If I change this to schema, just so it's a little bit easier to see, you can see that we've received a number of objects. We received a headers object. This is all of the data from my browser while it was visiting this resource. We're sending in what kind of computer I'm using, the various user agent fields, the browser that I was using, what sort of data I accept. All this stuff is obviously defaulted by my browser. What sort of encodings, right? There's a cookie. There's an IP address that tells me what country I'm in, for Christ's sake. It's really cool, right? We get all of that data from the browser. But we also have a few other objects here. There's one called params, which is empty. But this is a way that I could send or receive data to this webhook just using my browser, which I'll show you guys in a second. Now there's query. And then there's body. And then we also return back the webhook URL. And then we also have an execution mode, which we can use to test whether or not something is in production, or whether or not it's live, basically. Okay, so I just want to cover a couple of these output objects because these are really valuable when you're building your own webhook flows. In particular, these two, params and then query. I'm going to start with query, but essentially all query is, if I test this workflow again, all query is at the end of my URL, I see up here at the top of the page, if I just put a question mark, and then I put a variable name, then an equal sign, then some value. If I press enter, what I've done is I've actually sent a data packet that contains the key name of first name and then the value of Nick to this webhook. We can actually see this. If I close this out, scroll down to query, notice how we now have a variable basically inside of our webhook. So we've essentially used our browser to almost act like, a server or some sort of client or whatever. And then we've actually used that to send our webhook this perfectly packaged, nicely formatted data. So the query object is one way we can do this. With webhooks, you can also do it in another way. And I don't really use this way, but to be clear, these are both basically equivalent. There's very little of a difference in practice. What you do is use what are called dynamic paths. So let's say my webhook URL is the same, okay? But what you can do is you can have it listen for a parameter that is put in. If I have my path here, and I go /, then I have, actually, let me do this. If I have, static path. Okay, if I have this right over here, this little colon, what I can do is I can essentially add another variable in called, in my case, static path. Okay, so I have the power to put a variable in that when the browser accesses the thing using, like I'll show you, actually uses this format and then puts something in here, a name or a variable or whatever, I can actually get that returned as static path. In my case, why don't I go first name? That seems like it'd probably be a little cooler. Then we'll go last name like this, okay? If you don't fully understand this, then just watch that test event. Let me paste this in. Just instead of first name, let's go Nick. Then instead of last name, let's go my last name, Saraf. So now we just sent data again to this webhook. If I open this up, we go down to headers. What you see is now under params, we have first name, Nick, and then last name, Saraf. So all we're doing here is we're actually just being a little bit more restrictive with the values that you can send. We're basically saying, hey, you can only input those values in the first kind of backslash or first slash section of the URL. And then that has to be your first name. And then the second slash section has to be your last name. So in practice, I personally don't really do this. What I do instead is I just do, I'm just going to put this in here so I have some sort of param. But I almost always just use the query parameters. So I will actually just type in the name of the variable like this, question mark first name equals Nick, and then I'll just send and receive data that way. Very quick and easy way to communicate with a webhook, but there are a variety of others. Okay, so this is our browser accessing a website, which sends a GET request. There's also a couple of other ones. To make a long story short, what you can do is you could use your terminal, or you could use some web service, and you could just send a curl request. A curl request is just a way to send a GET or a POST very easily and quickly and simply. So if I want to communicate using a different mechanism, let's say my terminal instead, what I can do is I could curl, I could feed in the URL that I want. I could have question mark first name equals, let's do Nick, and last name equals Sarah. If you want to do more than one variable, what you need to do is you just need to replace it with a little ampersand. So I'm going to click listen for test event, press that button, And now you'll see, if I go back to my webhook, I've actually sent a first name and a last name, and I've done it in an alternative mechanism to just the browser, okay? That's not the only way to do so. You can do a variety of other ways to send and receive data. Probably the coolest one, and the one I'll wrap this sort of more academic section up with, is you can actually use N8N to send a request over to another N8N workflow. So if I open up another workflow here, I just call this sending webhook workflow. Then I'll just tag this as N8N course. What I can do is I could do an HTTP request, okay? And see here I can define the method. Well, I can actually just take this URL that I just had a moment ago, actually stick that right in here. And I can go first name equals Julio. Okay, and if I listen for a test event on this end, then I test it over here, what you'll see is I've now sent the exact same thing that I was doing before through a browser and through a curl request using my terminal or whatever snippet of code you want. It's just I've done so using another N8N workflow. So I bring this up because one of the cool use cases of N8N Webhooks is you can just use it to listen to other N8N workflows. So you could actually create this beautiful architecture in N8N or any real no or low code tool and just connect a bunch of these workflows together. So maybe you don't like muck up one workflow with a million billion things, or maybe you have things that run in parallel where while the main thread executes, you also send multiple other requests to webhooks that resolve and then send things back. This is how you get like really cool, infrastructure and like these beautiful orchestrations and workflows and stuff. But if you think about it, every time so far that we've sent or received some data, all we've gotten is this message, workflow was started, right? So obviously we can send data unidirectionally, and that's great. And if you know how to send data unidirectionally, you're already at like 50% of all webhook use cases. You're done. You can connect more or less anything on planet Earth together. But how about if we wanted to send data back the other way? And there are many use cases in which this is actually necessary, required, or valuable. How about if instead of just sending the data out, we also wanted on the receiving end, or on the sending end, how about if instead of just receiving data and do some of it, if when we sent the data out, we also got something back, okay? The value here is basically building an API, for instance, an application programming interface, or it's serving static HTML, or it's basically running your own little server that does something cool. And I don't think a lot of people realize, but this enables a whole other world of webhook use cases and possibilities. So I know I've been yapping your ear off with these possibilities. What do they actually look like? Well, let me show you. So if I connect to this, a webhook response node, I respond to webhook node, what you'll see is there are a bunch of options here. In order to turn this on, you need to head back to that first one and then click using webhook to, respond to webhook node here. What we're doing is we're basically tying a request together so that when we receive the webhook, we don't just send back that, message sent or message received or whatever, little piece of JSON. What we're actually going to do is we're going to define our own JSON to send back. So I'm going to go to respond to webhook. And I have sort of, 5 or 6 options here. I can respond with all incoming items, the binary file, the first incoming item, JSON, JavaScript or JSON web token, no data, redirect, or text. Now I use text most often, but let me run you through the rest of these as well. So the first and simplest way to do this is, let's say you're testing out this webhook and you want to make sure this webhook works. You can actually just respond with all incoming items. So let me show you what this would look like. If I test this workflow, okay, then I grab the same URL, which I think was back over here. Let me get rid of this. It's back over here, okay? And then I feed in first name equals Nick. Press enter. What happens now is we don't just receive that message received or whatever. What we actually get is we get all of the data that we are sending to the webhook immediately returned back to us. This is one of the easiest and simplest ways to test your webhook and make sure it's working. And then also just go through and then ensure that you are sending and receiving all the data you think you are. So for instance, we have all these ugly headers over here, right? But if you scroll down, you can actually see this query. We're actually sending over first name equal Nick. We're actually doing that right over here. Okay, if I were to change this, I would go and last name equals Sarayev. If I were to go back to my N8N webhook, test this workflow again, send it, and then I pretty print it. Notice how now we're actually sending 2 things. First name Nick, last name Sarayev. So we're actually visualizing this really easily, okay? So that's that first one, all incoming items. But to be honest, I really only use this while I'm testing. Now, there's binary file, which is you can respond with incoming file binary data. So this is very rarely used. Essentially, when you send or receive a request, you have the ability to do so in a bunch of different formats. Right now, we've been keeping it really simple. It's just text, right? Well, you can actually upload a file or send a file using binary. Binary is just like a representation of a whole file in zeros and ones. It's sort of how a computer views a file. When you view an image, you can convert that image to binary, and then you have the whole thing basically out as a big, long, scary alphanumeric string or whatever. So you can respond with a variety of means. I don't really ever use binary file, and I make a ton of money with this stuff, so I don't really think it makes sense for me to talk about it. But there are a variety of other things that you could do too. First incoming item. First incoming item is just when you have a lot of requests coming in, or a request with a number of items sort of bundled inside of it. Instead of responding with all of them, you can just respond with only the first one. So if I press test workflow now and do the same thing, in my case, it's going to be the exact same thing because I'm only sending one item at a time. But you sort of have the option to, if you want to send like multiple bundles or not bundles, sorry, multiple items or an array of items or something like that. This is always just going to grab the first one for you. Then I have JSON. So right over here, we can actually define what we want to send. Let's say, instead of message, your message is sent, I'll say, what's up, loser? My webhook is kind of an asshole. Okay, look, so now we're sending back this message, what's up, loser? How cool is that? I'm going to make my webhook notes nice instead of mean. It's all about that positive webhook self-talk. Anyway, so you can send obviously whatever data you want. Let's say you had a bunch of functions in between here that did something to the data, right? You had some first name, for instance, and then what you did is you had AI write a story about your first name. Well, you'd actually send that story back using this message parameter. So just because I think that's kind of cool, why don't I do that? I'm going to go and type in OpenAI. We're then going to message a model. I'm just going to connect this to my own OpenAI account, and I'll say, you receive a name, and then write a funny, short, 50-word story about that name. Your name is, or I'll say the, because I don't want it to misunderstand. The name is, and I'll stick in the first name right over here, okay? Then I'll also stick in the last name. Now I'm going to add a couple of constraints here. Maximum number of tokens, let's do 100. Keep the story short and light, I'll say. Then I'm going to go and use GPT-4o and, for a mini. It's even faster. I'm then going to test this with Nick, see what sort of output I get. Nick's arrived, decided to become, I should say, avoid using any quote characters since we're sending this in JSON. All right, perfect. No quote characters. Anyway, so now we have basically our own little API, right? We have an API where if you send a first name and a last name, what you get back is you get back a story about a person with that name. How crazy is that? So now if I test workflow, I go over here and I send first name equals Nick, last name equals Sarath. Look, this isn't going to execute right away. Why? Because sort of behind the scenes, what I'm doing is I'm actually generating the message. Now, I swear to God, if you added God damn, it's adding the quote again. You keep on adding quotes. No world domination for you. Absolutely no turning the universe into paper clips. Okay, great. Looks like it listened to me. Now I have an API set up basically that takes as input a first name and a last name, and it returns a cool message, which is pretty sweet, right? So this is a very simplified example, but imagine if instead of this AI node, I was doing a bunch of math on it, or I was doing a bunch of research, I was compiling a bunch of articles or something. Well, voila, I've just made my own service where you send that in, and then you receive in, this beautifully formatted, story about the person or whatever. So that's pretty sweet. If I continue down this respond to webhook rabbit hole here, you also have the ability to respond with this JWT. JavaScript or JSON web token. I think it's a JSON web token, right? Yeah, okay, it's JSON, not JavaScript web token. This is just another authentication or authorization mechanism. I don't want to talk too much about this stuff because in practice, I find that, if you're at the point where you're building out complex flows that return JWTs, you're usually probably like at the level where you don't really need no code or low code anyway. Like you could just build out your own server infrastructure. Then there's no data over here, which just allows you to respond with nothing. Then finally, you have a redirect, which is kind of neat. Now, the value here is I can actually send and receive data to my own website. So what I could do, hypothetically, is I could have a redirect where it comes to my server first, and then I just pass that data along, basically. But then I can also include some other data that maybe I would only get through the URL parameters, right? Maybe I only get like IP country from the specific request and I don't have access to it in my website. I don't know. But I guess what I'm trying to say is I could pass on data. They use this approach when, I don't know, they track affiliate links and stuff like that. You have some intermediary server that grabs the request first, gets a bunch of the data, adds it to a database, and then just forwards it over to the place you were going to go anyway. So you could use this to basically make your own affiliate links or make your own database or system. Okay, and the coolest way that I think you can respond is with text. Now, the value isn't actually responding with text. Because, if I just respond with text, what happens is I access this resource, then I receive just a plain text thing that says, hey man, you're cool. In my humble opinion, the value is in responding with HTML. Because if you get into the habit of responding with HTML, you can actually build a whole website and then you can serve it to people that come. This is one of the coolest things that I found personally and that I see. Oops, sorry. I definitely not just want to say chat to that. I had this generate me a quick and little easy template a moment ago. And basically what I do is if you just feed in some HTML, then I test this workflow. What I can do is I can actually have it generate me custom HTML that includes data that I send in the URL params. Now in this case, it's just saying hello guest. And I think the reason why it's saying hello guest is I'm not actually doing anything cool with it, right? But if I go to expression here, then I open this up and I go to where it says guest. Oh, it looks like I have some JavaScript down here. That's nice. I can actually just get rid of that. I don't need any of that JavaScript. If I go to here where it says hello, I can actually go comma space, and then I can add the name. So now it'll say hello Nick when I access the website, because that's what I fed in, okay? So now if I test this workflow and I enter this again, notice how the code now says hello Nick. What I've done is I've literally created my own server that responds to incoming requests with a full HTML page that I can insert dynamic data into, right? This, I think, is really cool because it opens up a variety of like customer-centric applications. Like let's hypothetically say that you get some data from some CRM or some service or some email or whatever. You can actually route that data in, and then you could style it on this page and you could tell people, like your client, hey, your data is right over here. They click the link, they get to this page that says, hello, first name, here's your data, or here's the email, or here's the CRM record entry, what do you want to manipulate? You basically have the ability to create your own applications with N8N Webhooks, which is obviously insanely powerful. You can do a lot with it. So that's the real main value here. Obviously, there are a few other kind of gotchas, but that's how you use webhooks, or I suppose that's a little nugget of how you can use webhooks to turn more or less any static flow into a dynamic one, connect any two apps, and just do a bunch of really cool things in N8N that you might not have considered possible before. Okay, the last thing I'm going to cover is I'm just going to do some authentication, and then I'm going to talk a little bit about how you can do like localhost redirects if you're running this on Docker, or you're kind of self-hosting with a mechanism that you may not fully understand how to send and receive requests with. So first, we'll just cover some authentication. Over here, you see how it says auth. I was doing none before, right? So my webhook was basically open for visitors. Anybody that pinged this would get the thing that I was returning. So in my case, I didn't actually, I didn't do the whole workflow here. I only did the test event. So I was basically just trying to see if I could receive data, and I could. But if instead I add authentication, I say basic auth, and I say username, and the password is just password. Well, now, unless you try and connect with username and password, it says unnamed because I didn't add a name to it. But unless you try and connect with username and password, you can't actually get the data, or rather you can't proceed. It'll ask you for your username and your password. So in order to proceed past this page, I actually need to type in user, then I need username and then password. That's the only way that I actually make it. Let me make this flow run the entirety of it just to show you guys. Okay. So I've now saved this in. I've basically saved my password. I believe it's cached the request or something. And so I'm just sending the data, and then I'm receiving it. It's just I didn't have a first name here. There you go. Let's run this one more time. But that first time, I had to access it with a username and password, right? So there are a variety of other authentication mechanisms as well. So that's basic auth. If I go to header auth, basically the way that header auth works is you'll put an API key in the header, or you'll be forced to put an API key in the header. So API underscore key, okay? And then this is a password, but I don't know. I'm just going to type the word password over here. Okay, so now, unless I add an API underscore key header with the value of password to my request, I can't actually get the data back. I can't actually see any sort of result from this, okay? So if I were to just try using my browser, which is obviously the simplest and easiest way to access any webhook, if I just type this in, what you'll see is authorization data is wrong, okay? Let's jump over to another N8N flow, and let's try and get the HTML of the page. What you'll see is we can't unless we add that API key header. So now if instead of doing it in my browser, I try and send a request through HTTP, okay, I'm just going to grab this URL again, I'll feed it in here. Even if I test it this way, what you'll see is it says forbidden, check credentials. But if I send headers, then I have an API underscore key parameter with the password, with the value password. And then I go back here and I wait, then I test. What you'll see is I've actually gotten back this HTML that I was looking for, right? We've actually allowed this to proceed with the flow because we put in the header auth credentials. So these are the two most commonly used ones. I'm not going to touch on JavaScript or JWT auth just because there's a little bit more involved and you have to add like a passphrase and a secret and you have to hash stuff with algorithms. I'm not going to worry about that. But I guess the point that I'm making is this is like your password. This is the knock, knock, give me the secret code and I'll let you in of the webhook world. And if you guys want more learnings or knowledge around authentication, just check out N8N, JWT, and then webhooks. And there'll be a variety of community articles that talk specifically about how to do JWT stuff. But I mean, in practice, I mean, well over, I guess like $2 million, well over $2 million now with no code tools. I don't really sweat like JWT auth or anything like that. Just kind of puts the cart before the horse, If you're at the point where you're like building all this super complex auth flow stuff, in my humble opinion, you're better off like actually developing the thing, not doing it in some no code or low code builder like N8N or make.com or Zapier. But what do I know? Okay, so yeah, that's that. Another common thing that you'll see a lot of the time is, if you use a service, I'm going to use a service called render.com here. This is a self-hosting service. So if you don't know how to self-host on Render, then feel free to check out my other self-hosting tutorial. It was like the last or the second last video that I posted. But essentially, this server, which is running on a free plan, by the way, which is why it's taking a little bit of time to spin up. I think it's going to take an additional like 30 to 50 seconds or something. This is more or less what it's going to look like if you haven't done that. So as we see, it says localhost : 5678. I think it's just the default one that N8N defaults to. / webhook -test, and then I have like some other ID. I just had to switch instances. So just make sure that, first of all, if you're self-hosting using Render, you always have a capital webhook underscore URL equals to whatever the root is of the render instance. You get the root of the render instance just by going up here. So just copy that puppy over and then paste it in. If you're using some other hosting mechanism, I just want you to know that they're basically all the same. You have the option to put environment variables somewhere. You just have to point it at the right URL. There are also some situations in which you might not actually have a URL. So in a situation where you don't have a URL, or maybe you don't have a domain, I should say, like this, what you need to do is you actually need to go and you need to add it to the configuration options for the specific host. So in my case, in Render, if you go to settings and then you go, I think domains, right down here, what you can do is you can point a custom domain to the service. If you don't have that, what you have to do is you have to set up what's called a reverse proxy. Nginx, I believe is the way that they say it. This is probably the simplest way to do it with Docker. So what you do is you have to essentially set up like an Nginx configuration file, and then you have to add that to your N8N install. If you go N8N, Docker, and then Nginx, you'll see a variety of community help articles that show you how to do so. I'm not like a big server guy and DevOps guy, so I typically like to stay away from this whenever possible and just focus more on cloud hosted. But just so you know, if you are using a self-hosted offering, you basically opted into doing a little bit more of the tech work in order to get more, presumably cost savings and stuff like that. So that's just something that you need to know. I hope you guys appreciated the video. I had a lot of fun putting it together for y'all as per usual. If you have any questions about this, feel free to drop them below. If you have any suggestions or ideas for future content, I'd love to hear about it. I get most of my ideas from my audience at this point. So this video was because somebody asked me a bunch of questions about N8N Webhooks in one of my comments a while back. Yeah, it'd be nice if you subscribed, liked, did all that fun YouTube stuff to bump me up to the top of the algo as well, obviously. But I won't force you to. And, if you subscribe, you can always just unsubscribe later. Who knows? Anyway, thanks so much. Looking forward to next time I record. Cheers.